organizers in putting, better? Thank you. Thank you for putting together such a diverse and intimate conference, although I have to say I feel quite intimidated by this whole auditorium setup. Today I will speak about the mortuary practices of the Lhokpu, and if you haven't heard much about this social cultural group, don't worry, I will want to begin by giving you some context. Here's a map, The Lhokpu community resides in southwestern Bhutan, and on the face of current evidence, what we have so far, they appear to represent one of the oldest populations of the country. This group is generally called Lhok or Doya by their Drukpa and Lotsampa neighbors, so Lhokpu is the community's autonym. The Lhokpu community includes roughly about 2,000 individuals, and it's spread over 5 villages in the Dopuchen and Tading Gevoks of Samtsi district. The Lhokpu settlements in Dopuchen Gewok are Sataka Sanglung, Jigmisinge Wangchuk, which is also known as Lotokuchu, and which in this map you can see is shown by the upper diamond. In Tading Gewok, which lies further to the south, the Lhokpu live in Taba and Jamte. All communities speak Lhokpu, or as they say, Lhokpu Katam, a Tibeto-Burman language. The northern and southern settlements have developed different dialects, which outsiders believe to be mutually intelligible. So from my personal experience, especially young Lhokpu find the other dialect very hard to understand. Most often they'll say that they cannot understand and they communicate in Dzongkha or Nepali. While both groups consider themselves Lhokpu and are also thought to be one social cultural community by their neighbors, such as the Toto, matrimonial and social relationships between them are rare. The genetical, historical, and cultural relation of both groups has yet to be validated. The Lhokpu language is unclassified, but Céline Grollmann and Pascal Gerber have recently put forward a strong argument linking Lhokpu Katam to Dimal and by extension the Toto language. Although a connection to the Dung population has been hypothesized, not much is known about the origins of the Lhokpu. Traditionally, the Lhokpu are an endogamous community practicing cross-cousin marriage and matrilocality. The Lhokpu have their own belief system, but Buddhist influences are being weaved into the Lhokpu's religion over time. They are no longer as isolated, and with that, an evolution of older beliefs and traditions is evident. In this current period, the last community members who had experienced hardly anything but the Lhokpu way of life are passing away quickly, and those who have had a formal education or more modern work or even life experience have begun reshaping the culture. One important aspect of the Lhokpu culture that is persisting are the mortuary practices. So if you live in Bhutan, or if you keep up to date with Bhutanese media outlets such as Kunsel or BBS, you will have surely come across the subject of Lhokpu gravesites. I think even in the last 3 months I came across like 3 to 5 publications by popular media outlets. Today I want to focus on the material, spatial and ritual dimensions of these unique funeral traditions. And I have collected this data that I'm presenting today during my 2017 fieldwork. I draw on one specific case study that took place in the village of Satakaso in the northern settlement cluster. The Lhokpu entomb their dead above ground in tumuli that they call rombu. So you can see it here. This stone structure is the most durable part of the construct that has in total 7 material layers. The body of the deceased, a shroud, a bamboo mat, a wooden box, the rombu, the deceased's belongings and provisions that are given along, and a wooden enclosure. So the dead body first is secured in a flexed position, as you can hear, with the knees tightly drawn to the chin. It is then wrapped in white shroud, and in this carefully arranged manner, the body is placed on a bamboo mat, which is folded around it twice lengthwise and then twice crosswise. 2 bamboo canes hold this wrap in place. In this composition, the body is put in a wooden coffin, lying on its right side. The coffin is roughly square cut. It is built from kimber planks and bamboo canes. Gaps between the planks or at edges and corners are sealed with mud so the corpse is fully enclosed. The bases of the Rombu consists of 3 large stone slabs, on top of which the body and its enclosure is arranged so it faces the hills towards the southeast. Now, important is towards the southeast as seen from Sataka. If you go to Taba and Jamte, it would be towards the northeast. That is, and this is a short excurse here also, by the way when the Toto in India and West Bengal bury their dead, they make sure that their dead face the same direction and the same hills. Once the coffin has been correctly placed, stones are piled up, around and on top of the wooden box, forming the distinctive shape of the Rombu. On top of the Rombu, the surviving relatives place the personal belongings of the deceased, crockery and household items, as well as provisions. Always, the deceased is given his knife in case of a man or her sickle in case of a woman. Each newly constructed Rombu is surrounded by fencing and cover, as you can see here. The shelter is built on the day of erecting the Rombu. It is the outermost layer made of wood, bamboo, and cane. As Maurice Bloch once stated, tombs become the link between the living and a particular area of piece of land via the presence of the dead in the soil. The Rombus likely reflect foci of identity and memory, marking a sense of place for the Lhokpu and potentially those passing through. The Rombu are facultative, individual structures as opposed to communal grave sites, which have become a mean symbol of unity. So they link members of a group, such as lineage, to each other and to the land. Looking at the dispersed placement of the Rombu throughout the entire area may mislead one into assuming a lack of such an intention. But the land on which the Rombu is built is of utmost importance. They are always built on the individual's ancestral land. Once on ancestral land, the placement of the Rombu is determined by its surroundings. The space chosen should be set apart from houses or water sources. Pragmatically speaking, or as I was told, it will be built wherever there is space. Throughout the Lhokpu settlements, Rombus can be found at various intervals. When roaming the area, the difference between older and newer Rombus cannot be overlooked. Or rather, the older structures are easily overlooked as they are generally surrounded and overgrown by trees, bushes, and by various plants. No longer do footpaths lead to these. It seems almost as if the structures are being reclaimed by the land. In contrast, newly erect Rombus can easily be spotted even from a distance. When someone dies, his or her body is kept in their ancestral house for 3 days and 2 nights. One person takes responsibility for sitting with and caring for the dead body. Generally, this task falls to the spouse of the deceased or a close relative, such as a daughter or son. He or she will further be in charge of all future ritual procedure linked to this death, spread over 3 years. Rather extraordinarily, the Lhokpu do not engage any sort of ritual specialist to perform mortuary rites, or hardly any other rituals for that matter. They also don't relate to classical texts, or any written texts. The ritual responsibility remains solely among the members of the ancestral home. The night before I arrived in Sataka for fieldwork, Ajigem Doya, who was an old woman, had died. Her husband had passed away years before. Ajigem and Tomze had had 5 children. The oldest son, Wangchuk, had moved to his wife's house in Sanglung when he married as a Makpa. The second son is dead. The older daughter and her husband live in Samtsi, where he works as a school teacher. The middle sister lives with them in Samtsi. Only Sangeon, the youngest daughter, remains in Sataka. It was her to whom the ritual responsibility in relation to her mother's death fell. During the first 3 days after Ajigem's death, Sangeom sat with the body. She barely left her mother's side, feeding the corpse 3 meals a day. When eating herself, she made sure not to touch the plates or cups by having them placed on a banana leaf before taking that banana leaf into her hand. Another banana leaf was torn up and used as a spoon, so she never touched the food with her bare hands. After the first night, other members of the community came to the house and brought offerings for the deceased. After the second night, Sangeom, with the help then of her brother Wangchuk, carried Ajigem's body outside, where they positioned and wrapped it first in shroud, then in bamboo, before placing it in the coffin. Meanwhile, more members of the community gathered around the house. Once the body was tucked into its coffin, the procession walked from the ancestral home to the selected site of the Lhokpu. Wangchuk, who carried his mother's corpse, led the procession, followed by his sister Sangyeom, and only then the others. Once they arrived at the funeral site, the coffin was placed on top of the 3 stone slabs and enclosed by stones forming the Lhokpu. This building of the Lhokpu was done collectively by everyone present. Wangchuk and Sangyeom then placed the belongings of Ajigem atop the structure. Wangchuk a bundle with her clothes and a sickle, Sangyeom baskets, crockery, and a bottle of yu, what's the local millet beer Noah's chant. At last, the fencing was erected by a group of men. Once the Lhokpu was built, the mourners moved to a nearby clearing a little bit uphill. Here, food was prepared and together with yu offered to Ajigem by Sangyeom, her daughter. During her offering, she was surrounded by others, all of whom were holding individual, unprepared, unscripted monologues directed at Ajigem, wishing that she left this realm without unnecessary lingering. As many anthropologists have found, concern with souls at funerals is seldom a matter of ensuring their safe passage, but rather a matter of ensuring that they do not bother the living. So this applies to the Lhokpu as well. Then the remainder of food and yu was shared among the mourners, and in the afternoon everyone slowly gathered up their things and went home. Once the Lhokpu has been built, the main mourning period of the Lhokpu continues for a succession of 18 days if the deceased was a male, or 15 in the case of female Ajigem. During this period, close family members stay together at the ancestral home of the deceased. The first day after the funeral is considered elni, meaning a good day. On this day, family members resumed their duties, such as agricultural work. Wangchuk went to his wife's home during the day, but returned to his ancestral home in the evening. On the second day, male family members spent the morning at the river to catch fish. Then the male and female members of Ajigem's household gathered at the previous site of offering, where the fish were mixed with millet flour and presented on banana leaves. According to the Lhokpu tradition, the person who holds the wake preps the corpse and brings it to the Lhokpu, and any others who partake in this part of the process and thus touch the cadaver are considered to be offered by sipang. So that's the Lhokpu Katam word for defilement caused by death. They must cleanse themselves with the fish and millet mixture. Sangyeom and Wangchuk and some others took pinches of the mix first into their hands and then threw it in the air, thus ridding themselves from sipang. The remaining mixture was poured onto the ground by Sangyeom, who was again surrounded by wailing mourners who simultaneously yet individually addressed Ajigem. Day 3 is Laini, which translates as bad day. On Laini, members of the household of the deceased must refrain from all agricultural or construction work. And then from this day on, a 2-work day, 2 elnis, 1 rest day, Laini cycle begins that lasts until the 15th or 18th day, which is called Dolni, the final day. The period from the building of the Lhokpu to the Dolni is a state of transition for the mourners, at least as much as for the deceased, as they find themselves shifting back and forth between their ordinary social roles and the condition that death imparts in them. Dolni marks the completion of the stage. On Dolni, members of the community gather once more at the site of the offering. People bring grains, yu, and other food items. Food is prepared, including millet pancakes and cow meat. Had the deceased been a man, ox meat would have been offered. The millet pancakes were placed inside a basket with cooked rice and millet and then covered with thorny bushels to prevent any other spirits than Ajigems to touch them. The elaborate offering on Dolni took place in 3 steps. First, drinks were offered to Ajigem. Again, Sangyeom was surrounded by others. You can see her here pouring out the liquid as she performed the offering of the liquids. Her brother Wangchuk and others poured juice, yu, and beer into a small bowl on the ground, which she then picked up with her left hand, always with her left hand, and poured out in stages by flicking her wrist away from her body 3 times. Meanwhile, those around her wailed loudly, this time wishing Ajigem enough to drink. So it's quite a loud, actually, once you're there, it's really overwhelming because all of these people there, kind of recite or chant something, but very personal wishes towards the deceased. So it is nothing that repeats itself, nothing that has been written down anywhere. So it's quite individual and probably different with every funeral. After this, a short break was taken, during which everyone refreshed themselves with some eel. About 30 minutes later, the group gathered again for food offering. Sangye-om proceeded with offering meat, rice mixed with millet, and vegetables. Food was put into a small bowl on the ground, picked up by Sangye-om left-handedly, and poured out, while the group around her continued their wailing. Once the food offering had been performed, a longer break was taken, during which everyone was given food and drinks. Finally, the group gathered again. The basket with the millet pancakes was brought. First, Wangchuk and the other members of the family poured drinks again, which Sangye-om offered again. Then Wangchuk lifted up the basket and poured out its food contents, wishing his mother enough food. When all of the basket contents had been poured out, he took the basket with him down to the rombu, where he marked it with a blow of his knife. He shouted that the basket and all food that had been offered now belongs to Ajigem, as he placed it on her rombu. With this, the offering was concluded. Slowly, everyone walked to Ajigem's house, where they were offered yu, and the gathering ensued. Sangye-om walked around the premises, burning titapati, the smoke of which he offered to all guests. Every year after the harvest, such a food offering to Ajigem will be performed by Sangye-om for 3 years. During this 3-year period, the members of Ajigem's ancestral home have to refrain from conducting their annual ritual to their ancestral class, inhibiting the extended family spiritual practice. But most directly affected is the spouse. Several markers frame the new social state of widowhood. Widows or widowers may not enter anyone's house. They have to always sit or stand on the left side of others, or let them pass on their right. They may not attend community rituals, nor address their class. They may not remarry during this time frame, nor not cut or comb their hair, clip toe or fingernails, wear ornaments, shoes, or any new clothing. After 3 years, the period is over and the widow or widower is free. The Lhokpu from Sataka often point out how one thing or another is done differently in Lotokuchu or Taba and Dante. For example, they bought the meat that was offered on Dolni, but traditionally and in the other hamlets, they say, sacrifices are performed. Without additional data, it will be premature to draw general conclusions about Lhokpu mortuary practices. Only through continued research can we bring these practices into a more secure cultural and temporal framework, which is really necessary. I do, however, want to touch briefly on a couple of clues that might serve as starting points or inspirations in doing so. One, the rombu structures themselves. The ongoing anthropologic and archaeological research in the Himalaya, particularly of scholars such as Guntram Hazard and Mark Aldenderfer, continues to unveil the significant variation in pre-Buddhist era mortuary practices. One theme that characterizes mortuary traditions is the transformation of telluric, meaning below-ground facilities, to tumuli and mounds on the Tibetan plateau. The appearance of above-ground mortuary facilities is dated to the late Neolithic into the Imperial era. Mark Aldenderfer further hypothesizes that telluric burial began a transformation in western Tibet, actually, relatively early, and this region may have served as a possible inspiration for the appearance of mounds and tumuli burials in central Tibet at a somewhat later date. 2. The positioning of the dead. The process of laying out the dead is underlined by spoken and unspoken rules about how the corpse should be presented. Although it seems obvious that the posture of the corpse has significant impact on the representation and experience of death at the outset, studies of corpse positioning are seriously lacking in any given time period or geographical region. The positioning of the cadaver has often been taken for granted among anthropologists and archaeologists, and glossed over or even omitted in archaeological excavation reports, ethnographic field notes, and research literature. Beaker burials of late Neolithic and early Bronze Age year, for example, were commonly associated with flexed or crouched bodies lying on one side, generally accompanied by grave goods. 3. The food offerings. George van Dream articulated that the Bhutanese practice of offering a meal to a deceased person may be a custom which, I'm quoting, the Ngalong adopted from the forebearers of the native Lhokpu or native Lhokpu-related population of Western Bhutan. In contrast to the Lhokpu, however, the Ngalong ritual has a more formalized character. What ends. More ritual markers are to be found throughout the extended eastern Himalayas. For example, total widowhood is very similar to that of the Lhokpu. It would, however, be futile to hypothesize at this point who inspired whose practice. But through ongoing research and the development and possibilities, I believe we will sooner rather than later get a sense of where these practices originated and how they traveled and shaped other communities. And one way to do so might be an extensive comparative study focusing on communities in and surrounding Bhutan. I believe that such a project could well be done in collaboration and pooling resources and have the additional benefit in bringing scholars together and creating synergies. And I was actually hoping to maybe kick something off during this conference. Thank you.